Thanks very much for joining. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes as more participants come into our virtual room here. All right, well, thank you all for joining us. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I serve as our California Natural Resources Secretary. And today I'm going to be moderating what will be a really interesting conversation with leaders from across the state, focused on exactly what we're collectively doing to strengthen wildfire resilience across very different parts of California. First, I want to just share with you a message that I hope everybody is safe in navigating this pandemic. It's obviously been a challenging last several months. I think we're very optimistic as we watch every day more and more vaccines come into California and actually get distributed across our population. If you want to better understand when you or your family member is eligible for a vaccine, you can log on to myturn.ca.gov. And within 2 or 3 minutes, you can actually put in your information and you'll be notified when your category, including your age group, is eligible to make an appointment for a vaccine. So obviously, as we navigate COVID-19, we're navigating another major challenge in the state, and that is, of course, catastrophic wildfire. So today we're going to spend time talking to 4 leaders in different regions that are driving on-the-ground progress, are reducing vulnerability to catastrophic wildfire. We're also lucky to be joined by 2 key legislative leaders that are driving on this issue, Assemblymember Jim Wood from Northern California and Senator Henry Stern from Southern California. So in just a moment, I'll start off our discussion by providing some context for the conversation, and then we'll turn to our panel and have an interactive discussion to really learn how the work is happening across California and what state government can do to support it. And then following that panel discussion, we'll hear from Assemblymember Wood and Senator Stern and get their thoughts on both the discussion and the sort of outlook among policymakers in Sacramento for moving forward on this issue. There will be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions throughout the discussion. The way that you'll do that is you'll go to the bottom of your screen and click onto the Q&A button and type in your question or your observation. And then I'll do my best as moderator to integrate those questions into the discussion and make sure we can answer as many questions as we can, and also integrate any perspectives or observations that you have. Thanks once again for joining. So let me share some sort of set the context for the discussion here today. James, if you could turn it to the next slide, that'd be helpful. So really, I think we all recognize that this is a moment when we need to double down on strengthening wildfire resilience across California. This pie chart on the left shows the most destructive wildfires in California's history by acreage. And what it shows you is that 17 out of the 20 most destructive wildfires have happened in the last 20 years. 5 of the 6 most destructive wildfires in the state's history were burning at the same time last summer. So one key reality check is climate change combined with other drivers, including a legacy of fire exclusion, are driving worse and worse conditions for these catastrophic wildfires to take place. Easily my weirdest moment of 2020 was finding myself in a conversation with then President Trump, asking him to acknowledge the role that climate change is playing in our wildfire challenge in the West. But we know, given all of this, that we cannot respond our way out of this crisis. CAL FIRE is among the largest and most sophisticated wildfire fighting forces in the world, but even CAL FIRE is outmoded in addressing the overall scale and severity of the challenge that we have. We have to do a lot more upfront. And that really is reality check number 2, which is cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution from Sacramento. California is a big place with diverse landscapes and communities, and we have to help regions build and implement regionally tailored strategies to reduce vulnerability to catastrophic wildfire. That's much of what the discussion is about today. We also recognize that while we have to do that landscape management, the so-called forest management, whether it's Sierra forest or woodlands or chaparral, we also need to invest within communities through home hardening, defensible space, evacuation planning. It's not a landscape management or community resilience. It's both. We also need to obviously reintegrate more low intensity prescribed fire across the landscape, recognizing that this policy of fire exclusion at all costs over the state's history has led in part to the challenge we face today. We also need to recognize the link between the ecological health of our landscapes and the economic health of our rural communities. We think that actually by scaling up landscape management, we can provide more economic opportunities across California. And then lastly, an obvious but important point is the name of the game in terms of making durable progress is partnerships. State agencies certainly aren't doing it alone. The federal agencies own over half of our forests. Counties, cities, local resource conservation districts, frankly, know best how to get it done on the ground and know where the challenges and opportunities are. So with all of these points of recognition, we're moving forward in an aggressive way. Next slide. And our administration's approach to double down on wildfire resilience is really articulated in an action plan that was released earlier this year called California's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. And what it tries to do is get our arms around all of the existing priorities that we need to fit together and identify additional priorities to actually address this problem at the scale required. It helps to implement important recent legislation. Our legislators have been leaders really leading this effort around what we need to do. And so this action plan helps to implement legislation. It calls for specific measurable actions that we need to help hold ourselves accountable for. And it advances the landmark agreement between Governor Newsom and the U.S. Forest Service last summer. That, among other things, set a target of landscape management in terms of acreage, 1 million acres of projects across our landscapes to reduce catastrophic fire risk every year. And so we obviously have good partners on the ground from our federal agencies, and this shared stewardship agreement was a really good sort of North Star to deepen that partnership. And so this action plan helps implement that. And then we developed this through a collaborative process, and specifically what was called the Forest Management Task Force over the last 2 years, which really assembled perspectives from across California to develop these proposed actions. Next slide. This action plan is paired with the governor's proposed budget, which was released in January, which calls for $1 billion of investment in wildfire resilience. That's about 10 times the amount of kind of annualized investment in wildfire resilience to date. That proposal is before the legislature, and the legislature is considering whether and how it would invest in wildfire resilience for next year's budget. And that budget process culminates in June. And of this $1 billion, we really invest across 4 key areas of the action plan: increasing the pace and scale of landscape health projects, strengthening protections of communities, that's the home hardening, defensible space, community planning, managing forests to achieve both our economic and environmental goals, including driving an alternative wood products market to do more ecologically based forest management, and then drive innovation, utilize science and technology, and then measure progress around building this resilience. So thanks, James, for those slides. You can take, there you go. So that's really the context. And I think we have 120 legislators and the governor who are aligned that building wildfire resilience is a critical priority. But I think we all recognize it's only going to happen through leaders across California actually identifying what's needed and getting these projects done. So we have 4 of those leaders from very different parts of California today that we want to talk with to better understand just what's happening in their part of California that we can actually learn from as we expand our efforts across the state. And I want to share just, I'll list the 4 participants we have, and then I'll turn to discussion. We have Irvin Jim with us, who is chairman of the Hung-A-Lelti community of the Southern Band of the Washoe tribe. He's also president of Intertribal Council and a newly elected Alpine County supervisor. Also with us is Susie Kirshner, who's a programs manager at the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District in Southern California. Also with us is Karen Gaffney, who is helping to lead the North Coast Resource Partnership, which is one of the longest serving models of this type of regional prioritized effort in the state. And then lastly, Todd Sloat, who's a restoration specialist and project manager for 2 resource conservation districts in the northeast part of the state, think sort of east of Mount Shasta, the Fall River RCD and the Pitt River Resource Conservation District. I'm going to ask each a question where they can share about 5 minutes of their thoughts, and then we'll jump into a more of an interactive discussion, integrating your questions. So I'll start with you, Chairman Jim. You have a sort of an inspirational story to tell about your tribal community's engagement in wildfire resilience as a continuation of environmental stewardship that's been lasting 10,000 years across California, and also your leadership in a very innovative program called the Calaveras Healthy Impacts Product Solutions, or CHIPS, connecting workforce opportunities to forest management. So welcome to the discussion here today, and I'm interested to hear you talk about some of your experiences as a tribal leader and advancing this CHIPS program.
Yeah, thank you, Wade. Our program, we started with, I've been in office as the chairman of this community for 6.5 years, going on 6.5 years now. And in the beginning of my first term, I heard of a company in one of our council meetings, a group called CHIPS, doing cultural site protection on the headwaters of the McCollum. And I was, I'm a cultural monitor by trade since '96, and I was thinking, who was doing cultural site protection on Washoe sites? So I started paying attention in the meeting, and one thing led to another, and I was introduced to a gentleman named Steve Walensky, who is the board chair for CHIPS, and that was 5.5 years ago, and we started then. And I was looking into it, and he asked me if we had a viable workforce over here in Alpine County. And nobody ever thought to look on our reservation for a viable workforce. And all I really did was turn their eye to our community members, the young men here in the community, young ladies. And we started out with a group of 6 individuals that were going over to Calaveras, over the top of the mountain to the west side, and they were working that first season. And there's 2 or 3 that stuck with us through this whole time, and they are now leads for our crew. But we've expanded. Last year, we kind of expanded a little bit too much and got ourselves into trouble, but we are narrowing it down and moving forward. But it was a beautiful thing for our crew. We got a contract with the LTBMU, the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit. And for those of you that don't know, that is our ancestral lake. And back in the early 1920s, 1910, our Washoe people were kicked out of that lake. We were kicked out of the area. We couldn't go there. So we, for our crew, our young men and women to be able to go back into there, because we all believe as Native Americans that we were put here on Mother Earth to be the caretakers of our homelands. And we had that chance, and we jumped on it, and we excelled in it, and it's really, really awesome. And our ancestral footprint for the Washoe tribe goes from the south end of Honey Lake to the northern tip of Yosemite Park, and it's all on the mountaintop. And We cover a lot of forests, and for us to be caretakers of our own homelands is a beautiful thing. And I would like to, we are partnering and moving forward with trying to expand our base program with CHIPS. We got another grant from, I think it's the SNC that we got to do outreach to other tribes to try to get them into the same workforce that we are doing. So moving across the state and in the Washoe tribe, our environmental department has reached out, and we are starting to look at the avenues of doing the traditional cultural burns. So we'll be reaching out to Governor Newsom and expanding on this whole thing and just making it tribal wide for all the tribes in the state of California. And like you stated, I'm the president of the board for Intertribal Council of California, and having that, sitting in that position gives me the ability to reach out to other tribes. So that's what I'm gonna be doing, focusing on this year and just making it bigger and better. So.
Well, it's hugely exciting. And, I think, we're learning every day from the tribal practices, of course, that have been in practice since time immemorial around managing the forest. And you mentioned the prescribed burns, and, with state law that prohibited those prescribed burns from tribal communities for decades, and that we're now actually relearning and where possible, learning that traditional ecological knowledge from tribes like yours around what we should be doing. So it's really, really impressive, the work that you're doing.
Yeah,
also great that you bridged to the county, Alpine County now as an elected official.
Oh, it's crazy, Wade, I tell you. But yeah, back to that traditional burning, one of the things that our Washoe people did in Lake Tahoe in the wintertime, we went up there in the summertime, and when that first snow came in, we lit it up and we left. But because we did it year after year after year, we never had to worry about the ladder fields, the crownings or whatever, because these are not the first droughts that we are going through. You look at the tree mortality and the rings in the trees and everything, it tells you all the whole history. And it's so there's droughts that we've been in before, and it's just reopening up that door and getting our traditional practices back in there. And that's what I wanted to point out. And then another comment that I heard about Earth, Mother Earth, Mother Earth, if you think back, any one of us as human beings can live without our birth mother. But there ain't none of us that can live without Mother Earth. So something to think about. So,
yeah, well put. So let's shift several hundred miles to the south to the Inland Empire and ask Susie, what does wildfire resilience look like in a populated area, much drier, not the sort of pine covered forest, but a very different landscape? What's happening down there that we should be supporting?
Sure. So yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I would say, a lot of our involvement with the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District in this effort came directly from funding and support we received from the state through the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. This has really enabled us in our region locally here in the San Bernardino Mountains to address some of these bigger questions around building partnerships and collaborative efforts and regional planning. So some of what we've been working on recently, we did enter into a participating agreement with the San Bernardino National Forest to enable us to work on shared stewardship projects on their land. And about 80% of the forested area in the San Bernardino Mountains is Forest Service managed. So we've been really working as a region to all work together in supporting on the ground work in those mountains. And through this shared stewardship effort, we've been able to hire seasonal staff to support NEPA projects. We've been able to hire contractors as the RCD to support those projects. And we're currently working on a large scale planning project where we're using LiDAR that we are gathering through this effort for regional planning. So I think kind of that's one of like the big picture goals of what we're trying to do is build these partnerships. This is with Forest Service, but we're doing this also with San Bernardino County, CAL FIRE, and just really trying to figure out how this web of partners can play together and set up agreements and a baseline of how we can partner together. We are also working on a regional priority plan, which is a big goal of this effort, to make sure that we're all working together to address what these large projects and priorities are for our region, and moving forward with the planning elements so that we are ready when future funding is available to go after this funding and implement projects. And I do think, we do have some unique challenges in Southern California, which I think, we'll probably talk about throughout, but while we do have a lot of forested land, we also have a lot of chaparral wildlands to manage. And unlike forested land, there's not always a consensus on how to manage chaparral, and since it's important habitat. Sometimes when you introduce, fuel reduction work in a chaparral habitat, you're also maybe introducing invasive grasses. So just a lot of challenges, I think, around managing these types of ecosystems. But the support through the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program has been really integral in, I think, making these connections and priorities and being able to, as a region, determine where funding and projects need to take place.
That's really helpful and really interesting that you're navigating different landscapes from, it sounds like maybe more your pine forest all the way to your chaparral. How has the partnership been with the Forest Service? Sometimes the stereotype is sort of partnering with the federal government or state government is really cumbersome. How would you characterize the partnership to actually get on the land within the Forest Service and do that vegetation management work?
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, I think with really any partner, sometimes it just comes down to key individuals and just specific people who really drive the partnership forward. And I think here in our local San Bernardino National Forest, we do have those people who really work to move forward this partnership and make sure to find time to collaborate, even when there's a lot of other work going on. So I think the partnership has been successful. I think we still have work to do in terms of, setting aside time to work together to make these projects happen. But I think just really open to getting that support. And I think realizing that with additional state funds, and then we have the San Bernardino Municipal Water District here locally is really interested in developing a stronger partnership and investing local funds into this effort. So I think they're starting to come to terms with this idea that, these partnerships are going to be really key for Forest Service to be able to accomplish their goals.
That's really helpful. And I've realized that, the composition of the partnerships looks very unique in different, in each place. And I just want to give a shout out to the resource conservation districts generally. We have several hundred people in the discussion here today, and not everybody may know what a resource conservation district is. But the way I've been educated is it's essentially an organization that exists to kind of weave together these partnerships and bring resources from different sources all together in furtherance of one sort of common priority.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to put a plug in for the RCD network. I know Todd is representing an RCD as well. And I think that is key is, for one, we're able to work between private and public lands interchangeably. So we are really good at connecting those different land management type, landscapes. We also are able to make progress occur rather quickly because of a very local government. We operate with our local boards, so we're able to move projects forward and fill some of those gaps that sometimes slip through when, a state or federal agency isn't able to accomplish something for whatever reason. So,
yeah, great. And I'm interested in Todd's perspective on the RCD role too. So, you mentioned, Susie, the effort that's building in the Inland Empire to develop this sort of regional plan with priorities that you want to get done. And, as I've been educated over the last couple of years on this, the model that's always brought to the discussion around this sort of regional plan, regional set of priorities is this North Coast Resource Partnership. And we're very lucky to have with us Karen Gaffney here today, who's been, I think, with the Resource Partnership for the better part of the 17 years of its existence. And I asked Karen to share with us a little bit more about the partnership particularly given it could serve as a model and provide some key lessons learned to other parts of California that are not as evolved in developing a type of partnership like this. So Karen, I think I want to hear from you around what the partnership is and what you've learned. And I think you also have some slides to share with us.
Yes, thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. It's great to be here with you today and really appreciate the invitation to participate in the conversation. I do have a few slides here. So the North Coast Resource Partnership was formed in 2005, and yes, I have been with it since its inception, and it's led by representatives of local, tribal, and county governments. So this photo is our current tribal and county co-chairs, as well as former tribal and county leaders. And the partnership has a long history, including now with the Forest Resilience Action Plan and other state objectives and plans of aligning with translating and downscaling state and federal objectives through our unique regional lens. And since the beginning, our leaders have focused on regional equity and a respect for the diversity of perspectives in the region and seeking common ground and kind of what unites us rather than what divides us. There's also a strong focus on multiple objectives and achieving multiple benefits, ranging from the health of watersheds and wildlands to climate action to local economic opportunity. And there's been a really long-term focus on making sure that economically challenged communities have every opportunity not only to participate and contribute to planning, but to also be able to participate in project implementation. And we have implemented hundreds of projects. We've identified thousands. Many of them are focused on forest resiliency and health, as well as fuel load reduction. And we have an ongoing data-driven prioritization and ranking process that includes peer-reviewed spatial analysis and modeling at the regional scale, but it's also integrated with local knowledge, including traditional ecological knowledge. Next slide, please. So the North Coast region in the map here, as we define it, includes the tribal and county lands, including the area that you see on the map. The region is 19,000 square miles, or 12% of California. And it is a source region for water and biological diversity, and it also has massive amounts of carbon stored in its forests, and it's home to critically important cell-mounted populations in California. The region has 34 federally recognized tribes, and it has significantly degraded built and natural infrastructure, ranging from water quality and wastewater infrastructure that is failing, and also degraded streams and forests in need of restoration and enhancement. And the rural North Coast region, as I mentioned, is home to some of the most severely economically disadvantaged communities in California. And like all of California and the world, it's facing more and more extreme events related to climate change, including floods and fires. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we have a focus on data-driven prioritization. So this graph is the result of a regional carbon analysis in collaboration with the Climate Action Reserve, funded by the Strategic Growth Council that we did a few years ago. And at the time, it was documented that North Coast forests contained over 4 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent, i.e. emissions that were locked up in trees and providing all sorts of multiple benefits and not being emitted into the atmosphere. Sadly, the amount of carbon held in trees in the North Coast region has changed significantly since this work was done. So ensuring multi-benefit forest management is a really high priority for us and something we're excited to collaborate with the state on. Next slide, please. So this is an example of kind of where some of that carbon has gone. In the slide, the graph on your left, you see the fire footprints in the region and outside of it between 1980 and 2000. In a 20-year period from 2001 to 2020, you can see, as Secretary Crowfoot was saying, how much those fire footprints have increased. And in the purple, you see the fires just in 2020 in the North Coast region. The North Coast experienced in that 20-year period on the right, about 25% of the fire footprints in California, and we're only 12% of the regional footprint of the state as a whole. The other thing I want to note is the purple 2020 fire footprints. Those emitted over 17 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent into the atmosphere. So definitely a climate issue. Next slide, please. So since our formation over 17 years ago, we have had a focus on multiple integrated objectives and benefits. And we're so excited to align with and downscale the ambitious goals of the Wildfire Action Plan and the governor's executive orders on climate change, biodiversity, and land conservation. In terms of forest resilience and wildfire, we see the work as a continuum from the wildlands to people's doorsteps. So we need this integrated multi-benefit solution that addresses forest health, fuel load reduction, community health and safety, while still achieving our long-term goals that we share with the state related to climate action, local jobs, revenue, healthy and natural working lands. And that's the end of my slides, but I think one thing I would like to share about the partnership is that there really is this 17-year focus on common ground and really focusing on what unites us rather than divides us. And if you know the region, there are very diverse perspectives, and there have been a lot of disagreements, some of them quite vehement, involving litigation over the years. But the leaders of our partnership, the elected officials from the counties and the appointed officials from the tribes, have chosen to commit to a culture of common ground where they leave their disagreements at the door and focus on what's best for our North Coast communities and the land. And there's also a very strong culture of a commitment to integrity and to equity and impact in fair dealings with one another and with project applicants, and really having an all boats rise with the tide model. And so, folks have said, what's the secret to the model? And of course, the resource partnership appreciates being viewed as a model, but also we've learned so much from other regions as well throughout the state, and appreciate the state bringing us all together to learn from one another. And I think really it's about that collaborative infrastructure based on trust and equity and fairness. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Karen. And I think when we were chatting a little bit about their partnership, you had explained that it started focusing on water in this integrated regional water management plan, or IRWIMP process that one of our agencies requires for funding. So is the partnership just focused on forests, or forest and other resources? Because sometimes we hear that sort of point of caution, which is avoid too many silos where you're dealing with, wildfire differently than water or biodiversity.
I think one of the hallmarks of the partnership since day one, we really appreciated the integrated regional water management program, and we took the integrated part to heart. And so since day one, there's always been a focus on how do you downscale and align all of the states and the local regions' objectives around healthy watersheds, water supply, water quality, human health and safety. So from day one, we've always tried to kind of turn that into an ensemble approach, recognizing that when you take that multi-benefit integrated approach, you actually probably get a lot more bang for the buck for the state. And we really believe that regional efforts like these have the ability to bring together the incredible ambitious objectives that the state has. I mean, we're a leader in the world, clearly California is, and our state government right now has so many ambitious high-level goals for achieving quality of life and resiliency, et cetera. And the regions, I think, have the ability to bring all of those things together through their specific regional lens and get a really great return on investment for the state. So I think they can be harmonized, and I think the regions can do a great job of that.
Thanks so much, Karen. As we move to our fourth panelist, I want to remind participants, first of all, we've got an impressive participation, almost 400 people here today. I want to remind participants, if you have a question or an observation, please click on that Q&A button and put it in the space that you have to type it in, and then we'll integrate it in here as we get into an interactive discussion. But let me turn to you, Todd. As I mentioned, you're a leader on the ground actually getting projects done in northeastern California. So I'm interested to know how the resource conservation districts you work with have actually tried to advance the sort of the pace and scale of work up there, and what role sort of the state plays in supporting your efforts.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Wade, and thanks for all the participants that joined the webinar today. The RCD really focuses on, in a general strategy of kind of identifying bottlenecks or gaps in resource needs or community needs. and then trying to either connect existing partners to build capacity with them or try to fill the void themselves. So I also started the Irwin program years ago in a collaborative, and then more recently in 2010, we had a new collaborative in this region start, really to try to address forest health and fires and fuels, because we realized that was the majority of our watershed, 80 or 85% of it was forested area. And it was needing some attention. The QLG days, Quincy Library Group days, had decreased funding to our federal partners, and there was a big void there in just the amount of people to plan and develop projects and implement projects. So the RCD really tried to step up and work with our federal partners, in particular through a master stewardship agreements, and just all hands on deck, and identify our assets, identify the barriers, identify actions that were relatively simple that we could implement, and pursue avenues and diverse streams of funding and diverse streams of projects to build a portfolio that was attractive to folks when opportunities came along. So, and as far as the state's role, I mean, I started off as a watershed coordinator through the Department of Conservation program years ago, and it was a great program, and I was glad to see it revitalized again in working with SNC, because those programs really provided some of that seed money for individuals to really kind of look at those areas that needed some attention, that weren't getting attention, and provide some support.
Well, thanks, Todd. I'm appreciative that you brought up the Department of Conservation program to develop or to fund these watershed coordinators. As I understand it, it was a popular and effective program years back, and it sounds like you were part of the first tranche of watershed coordinators. And then only recently, last few years, the Department of Conservation actually brought it back, and the governor and legislature funded it. And part of the governor's proposed budget is to actually expand the program within the Department of Conservation, that's run by a great colleague of ours named Kayla E. Bright, to actually fund watershed coordinators in parts of the state that really don't yet have these coordinated plans. So to really build off where there have been these regionalized plans, and then fill in the gaps, so that really every part of the state, again, we're not imposing a one-size-fits-all solution from Sacramento, but ideally we're getting funds into these regional plans and this pipeline of projects, and then ideally providing a consistent source of funding. So it's not off again, on again in a region like yours, Todd, that you can actually prioritize projects, get the planning and permitting done, and then you have funding over time to get them done. I'm interested, like, what types of projects are you doing up there?
Well, lately we did receive some CCI funds through some various projects, and had a great partnership approach for, some of the bottlenecks in that ask a couple of years ago was many of the forested regions in California are lacking foresters. We have a gap in capacity of technical expertise to develop and implement projects. So we partnered with the Shasta Community College to expand their heavy equipment operator program and truck driving program. That's kind of the human capacity side. And then on other projects, we focused on some very large landscape level projects that addressed trying to protect. We have Lassen Volcanic National Park on our southern boundary, and MacArthur Burning Falls State Park on our northern boundary. They probably have more visitors combined in the year than we have a population in our towns, actually. But yeah, just forest health fuels, a little bit of meadow restoration on occasion. And the one project I'm also super excited about is 34 North. An entity has really put together a data aggregation platform for us so that we can understand the data that we have to help us strategically prioritize projects better, and also monitor and report out on those projects better to our partners. Wow,
that's great. Well, listen, let's, James, if you can move us to sort of the Brady Bunch view, that'd be great, because I want to have the interactive discussion now. And I've have a question for you, Chairman Jim, first. We get a lot of questions and interest from folks across the state that want to explore partnerships for wildfire resilience with different tribal communities or tribal governments, but they're not sure exactly how to sort of develop those partnerships. So, being both a tribal leader and a county supervisor, what advice would you have for non-tribal leaders that want to develop or deepen partnerships with tribes in their region? What type of approach should be made, and what should we recognize in expressing that interest of partnership?
That is the question of the month there. My advice to them would be to find out when the community council or the tribal council meetings are. Attend there and find out who, the pecking order in the tribe, the chairman all the way down to your TIPO, your environmental directors or whatever, and start with that and open up that conversation. And, they're more than likely to be receptive of it. And, one of the things that tribes always have that always keep us back is that that term consultation, tribal consultation. There, as from a tribal member and seeing tribal consultation from what my experience I've seen working with these agencies and groups is that they've reached out to them and that was it. That was the extent of their consultation. So as Native Americans, it's like, here we go again. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like, have meaningful consultation. If you have a project and you want input from the tribe, bring them in the beginning, in the very beginning, and give them that voice that they want, that they need to have about the projects that are going on. That is my advice to that. Because seeing from my point of view, a year and a half ago, when the campfire, when FEMA came in with all that money to do the hazard tree removal, we tried to get a CHIPS crew in there. And one of the things that we tried to do was, from my understanding, speaking with Steve Walensky, was that FEMA comes in with all this money to do a hazard tree removal. They put all this money in there, and FEMA goes to the umbrella contractor. The umbrella contractor goes to the subcontractors. The subcontractors come in, they get the job done, they leave, and this money is supposed to be there to rebuild the community. Why not reach out like what we did in CHIPS, go into the town that was devastated by the disaster and see if there is a viable workforce. See, it's in the foothills. Yeah. You know that there's lumber, there's sawyers, there's, all these people that work in the woods. And we try to get them on and bring them in. And that way that money goes in there and it stays in there and it helps rebuild that community. So
it's a great point. And one of our participants, David, asked that very question. And he says, we spent a lot of money through Cal OES and FEMA on these hazardous tree removals and the recovery. But we tend in the state to use outside contractors, big contractors they're familiar with. Wouldn't it be better to use local contractors, including tribes, to do the work? That way, a lot more funds stay in the community. So that's really the point I think you're making is, hey, let's figure out a way to leverage all of that disaster, response money to hire local folks where that resource and that experience is, that funding and that experience is going to stay in the community.
Yes, exactly. And it will. I mean, that'll help rebuild that community economically, ecologically and everything. It just makes for a better, more well-rounded healing process. So.
Yeah, totally. I want to just ask Karen if you have anything to add in terms of the partnerships between tribal governments and federal, state, or local governments, given it seems like the resource partnership has developed a really strong model where there's sort of co-leadership of tribes and other governments. Anything you'd add in terms of the experience?
Yeah, I mean, I want to really appreciate what Chairman Jim said on many levels, but specific to tribal leadership, one of the things I think that everyone really values about the North Coast Resource Partnership is that it's absolutely tribal engagement. We have a tribal engagement coordinator. There's lots of tribal projects. There's a lot of tribal, engagement in the planning process, but probably more important than anything else, there is that co-leadership. And we have tribal co-chairs, tribal vice co-chairs, and tribal executive committee members so that there is governance and decision-making and leadership by tribes. So it's embedded throughout the entire NCRP process, which has been a huge benefit to the region. And in terms of capacity, I want to just echo and build on what Chairman Jim said. One of the things that's come up both from our tribal and county leaders is this need for multi-benefit, year-round, proactive local capacity that can do everything from prescribed fire to, home hardening education, to habitat restoration, to actually fighting fires when the time comes, so that communities like Wetchapec or small communities like Weaverville, when there's a big fire and the big resources get pulled elsewhere, they have someone there, and that it can be a year-round proactive investment in the community that keeps jobs local and keeps people working in their communities. So I also want to really support that comment about local procurement. I think it's a great investment by the state to keep jobs and revenue local.
Yeah, and we have to figure out how to do that local procurement nimbly, right? Because the community needs to get those trees down. And so I think sometimes why, an agency defaults to a big contractor is they can scale up and get it done quick. And so you need to get it done quick, but how then can you do that and utilize community members? I think that's a really good point. I want to switch a little bit, starting to integrate questions from our participants. Susie, question for you, but really also for everyone. Thomas asks, what level of Forest Service personnel have you had the most success in developing connections? Good question. Do you have to go to the top dog, in a manager of a forest, or are you identifying people on the ground, or what's the magic there?
For us, it's primarily been working with more project management or on the ground level staff. What we did initially when we were starting to build this regional capacity is we brought all Forest Service staff who were available to come to a meeting. And we started doing those meetings quarterly, where we kind of have an all hands on deck meeting. But then from there, I work with individuals depending on what the goals are. So sometimes I'll work with the specialists, like the archaeologist, to say, what do you need for this NEPA process? Or the botanist, what do you need for this process? Or the fuels planner. So generally I am working with either the specialist or someone on the ground doing the project work.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I know our regional forester in Region 5, Randy Moore, who's the kind of top leader of most of the entire state, minus a sliver on the east, is really bullish on deepening these partnerships. So we've got really strong political buy-in from U.S. Forest Service at the regional level. So Susie, you make the good point of, get with the folks that are actually doing the work and building the projects.
Right.
Antoine has a really tough question, but I think it's one we should ask ourselves, and I'm interested in your perspective. He says, there's a lot of great local initiatives that are not promoted and used at a larger scale to reach their full potential. For example, CAL FIRE funded defensiblespaces.org that got published just this past September, which is a partnership of local fire agencies, UC researchers, and environmental nonprofits. How can we promote these initiatives and reproduce these successful models in other areas? So, from your perspective as regional leaders, how would you suggest, either sharing what's working in your region or learning, tools or models that are working elsewhere? And what role could the state play?
Well, I'll jump in here. I would say that the RFFC program, as Susie referenced, has been fantastic at creating time and providing resources for sharing among different RFFC grant recipients, and that's been incredibly powerful. So we, for example, have learned a great deal from talking to people up in the pit or in Sierra Nevada Conservancy or down south. And I think learning about best practices and being able to reinterpret them through our own regional lenses is helpful. And also, frankly, to avoid replicating work and reinventing the wheel. So I want to really give kudos to the Department of Conservation for the way they structured this grant program.
Thank you. Todd, I saw you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was going to weigh in on that question. Some of the past state and federal investments into shared experiences like the RCDI program, the Sierra Institute for Community Environment had for several years, was super successful in kind of sharing information of success stories. Watershed Research and Training Center's Podio platform that's more recent, great platform for folks to get connected, to share lessons learned and information. And it's so critical now because this is such a complex problem that no one group or one individual in the group is going to have the answers or have the right people to connect to. But without an investment from the learning perspective, we're going to struggle. So making those connections as quickly as possible and getting that information out is critical.
That's great. there's a lot of interest in the Q&A just on this discussion around tribal partnerships and tribal leadership. And so Sharon had suggested the possibility or potential of bringing in tribal members and compensating them, from the get-go for engaging as deeply as they need to be engaged as consultants or contractors. Sarah suggests, actually, since we know that, this wildfire threat is not going away and we're going to need to have recovery, hazardous tree removal, et cetera, needed as early as next summer, why not work in advance to get, tribes and local communities FEMA ready so that they can actually plug into that recovery work? I think that's a really good suggestion. And then Vice Chair Williford from the Concow Valley Band of the Maidu joins us, and he asks that why aren't tribal groups used beyond just monitoring for cultural resources? So his communities within the Campfire Burn Scar, but they've only been reached out to monitor those cultural resources. And he suggests, what about tribal traditional burnings? So I think that is kind of putting it back on the state, as it should be, and other governments around, as we're doing the resilience work and the recovery work. Let's engage tribal leaders to really understand the full suite of partnerships they may be interested in. To Chairman Jim's perspective, I think your point was, hey, there's workforce out there. Part of the reason why your community's involved is you were sort of the connector, right, for folks. So that's all really helpful. And then Rowena suggests possible tribal engagement coordinators on a statewide basis to assist tribes in building capacity and to develop local and federal partnerships. So these are all really good suggestions. Parenthetically, our resources agency, for the first time, we've developed a position of an assistant secretary for tribal affairs. And so that person is coming on board this spring and may be able to follow up on a lot of these really good suggestions. Interesting question about energy, if I can bring this in, because we haven't talked about this. And let's see, Kelly says, question across the speakers. Are you integrating forest, watershed, natural land management, health policies with localized energy planning? There was mention of infrastructure as part of the plan. So interested in how energy planning fits into this, and whether there's thinking about energy, the multiple benefits of different types of projects. I think this is a really good question because there's a lot of discussion in Sacramento about energy resilience, given these public safety power shutoffs across the state and the loss of power. So interested to know if any of you in your region have integrated energy into kind of this regional wildfire resilience planning.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on that one. We looked at some assessments early on about 7 years ago about the potential to use kind of woody residuals for energy production and where the gap was. We lost, I think, around 25 megawatts of energy production in the last 10 years in our region. We still have infrastructure, fortunately, to process that, but we were looking at everything from small scale to, small buildings scale to more smaller scale, such as 3 to 5 megawatts. And the state's biomat program has attracted our attention, and we have a couple facilities, one facility that signed a 20-year power purchase agreement, another facility that's come to terms on another investor and a developer. And so we feel like we're kind of closing that gap of the material that's being left in the forest that's either burned in piles or just scattered around. And we're definitely excited about that opportunity, especially linking it to jobs in the future. Anytime you remove a product from the forest or do something that requires lots of labor and lots of jobs associated with that. And we're seeing the additional advantage of having these potential future facilities actually give up the majority shared position of that entity to the community after a certain profits are met. So it's something that I'm super excited about in our region, and I'm hopeful that other smaller communities and regions can have the same type of advantages in the future for that.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. That's a really active discussion in Sacramento, the role of so-called, bioenergy and using, that vegetation that you're, taking out of the forest in the ecologically based way to create energy. And there's real potential, obviously, for that, and it exists right now. There's also, questions raised about air quality concerns with legacy technologies. And so that's kind of an active discussion around what's the role of bioenergy and how do you put safeguards around the energy creation so you don't worsen air pollution. Speaking of air pollution or air quality, Gary asks, how do air quality issues fit into the prescribed burn planning mix, right? I think really prescribed burns have gotten very popular as a discussion or as a key priority, given its role in cultural practices from tribal communities and the potential of reducing the threat of that catastrophic wildfire. But there are obviously air quality issues, and the regional air quality boards, I think, have traditionally sort of restricted or limited the amount of prescribed burning as a result of the air quality challenges. So how are you all navigating that as you think about more prescribed burns?
I'll jump in. I was hopeful Karen was going to jump in on this one because I think she's got more experience in their regions. But we like in one of our collaboratives, we feel we're about 10,000 acres short on an annual basis from doing prescribed burning, and we're just now starting to really try to develop that capacity of developing burn associations, work with our tribal partners who have also an interest in doing prescribed burning to try to develop that capacity. We're realizing, though, that there are some very serious legal insurance issues to fix and also air quality permitting things to fix, because often the burn windows are so restrictive that it makes doing the amount of burning that we would like to do very challenging.
Yeah, and just to jump in quickly, we're collaborating with NASA on looking at the fate of smoke plumes, doing some modeling on that, certainly talking to our air quality boards, and really starting to think about more of an education and outreach program to educate people about the importance of prescribed fire as a tool in the overall portfolio. So I'd say we're in process and definitely have pretty strong elements related to prescribed fire and then the associated concerns about smoke in our RPP plan that we're developing. We're also looking at things like smoke taint as it relates to agricultural products in our region, like grapes.
Thanks. And I think it was Todd that mentioned the liability issues. Angelina pipes in that liability on private forest lands does seem like a huge barrier to prescribed fire in a significant percentage of the forests, and certainly in Siskiyou County. The question is, how is this being addressed in the legislature? And I think there's my own take, and we're going to be joined in just a moment by two legislative leaders. There's active discussion around how you address that unlimited liability that somebody has for doing prescribed fire on their land. I don't think that there's a silver bullet that's been identified yet, but I think it's identified right now as a key barrier that we need to address. But any folks, any participants here, glad to feel free to add more. Let me keep on going here and ask. Maybe I want to make sure that those folks who might not have a kind of a regionalized partnership already come away from this call, one, understanding that the state is trying to put more resources into these regional solutions, and two, there are models to learn from. So I guess what would any of you say to somebody that's working to bring people together across their region, but really in the nascent stage of that? What are sort of key lessons learned or pieces of advice you'd have?
I think some advice I would have, I know when we were first starting to build a regional partnership, I think one good first step in getting engaged in that is seeing what already exists. Because I know when we came in, there was an element of, we weren't aware of all of the organizations and kind of informal meeting groups that were already set up to tap into. And so I think finding those, because they probably do exist, whether they're informal or formal, and tapping into that, and then growing from there and recognizing there are existing partners, but let's expand that. I think that's a really great first step. And then also finding those key individuals who are going to carry this out, because I do feel like partnership building is a full-time job. It's a lot of work to develop and maintain those partnerships, and it's important to find kind of your equivalent at other organizations who are willing to put in that work.
I would just say, and I will say that we both intentionally moved in this direction and then kind of lurched into it over years, because we've been an adaptive process, and we've made some mistakes and missteps and learned from them. But the earlier partnerships can get to a set of basic principles and a collaborative infrastructure that really reflects the goals of the partnership. So, things like equity, things like governance. I mean, the fact that we have tribal and county elected leaders leading and governing and decision-making because they represent their larger constituencies, I can't say enough about how important that is. So really thinking about what, even if you're early and incipient, what do you want your partnership to look like, 3 to 5 years from now? And what do you want its basic foundational principles to be around, whether it's science-based prioritization or effective use of taxpayer dollars or equity and diversity and inclusion, transparency, et cetera. Those things have served us so well. And I think they apply whether you're small or large or incipient or established. And I think it gets the best return on investment for the community.
That's really helpful. I'll also again repeat that the Department of Conservation can be a hub of helping participants, as part of the discussion here today, understand what might be happening in your region. And because he can't kick me under the table, I'd identify Kayla E. Bright and his team at the Department of Conservation, the folks that fund those watershed coordinators, as key hubs to help build connective tissue. Susie, you raise a really good point, which is see what's already happening. And Jeanette, one of our participants here today, says, check out if your region has an integrated regional water management, planning group. That obviously was the way that North Coast Resource Partnership started, as Karen mentioned, because if it's actually a functional IRWM that's working well together, they may be well positioned to integrate wildfire into that. Douglas asked a really challenging question that I think we should put on the table, which is directed to you, Karen, but maybe something for all of us to consider. Karen mentioned there was about twice as much fire in her region in 2020 compared with, the past. What are the wildfire metrics that the partnership uses to evaluate success in terms of wildfire behavior? What results has she seen in terms of the amount of wildfire in her region? And this gets to the very tough question, because the science of wildfire is complicated, which is, how do we know, when our resilience investments and efforts are working? And Karen, have you guys figured out an approach around starting to track that?
We have had a long-term focus on collecting all of the available data, spatial and otherwise, from local groups and regional efforts and state and federal agencies for many years. And what we're doing right now is we're working with the Forest Service using their quantitative wildfire risk assessment approach and some of their other modeling and mapping approaches at the regional scale. And our goal, in fact, we were just having this conversation a couple of days ago, is to reach out to CAL FIRE and Dave Sapsis and Nate Roth at DOC and to really work with them to make sure that we're harmonizing the Forest Service approach to regional mapping and modeling with CAL FIRE's approach. And then, of course, as I said, we're constantly integrating local knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge into that framework so that we're not, taking this kind of black box, everything comes out of the model and tells us what to do approach, but rather a full continuum from objective spatial data all the way down to really knowledgeable local experts about what the prioritization framework should be. But for example, in Sonoma County, for example, they had the benefit of countywide LIDAR. And recently, the Ag and Open Space District there published a paper in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Special Journal on Fire, which documents how LIDAR was applied to look at ladder fuels and outcomes based on the fires in 2017. And that gives us a lot of great guidance to extrapolate out into the North Coast and to use as both, a snapshot of where we are now, but then as we do projects and bring them onto the ground, looking at, are we moving the needle? Are we actually targeting our investments in areas of vulnerability where there's a lot of residences, where there's a lot of fuel loading, where there could be really bad outcomes for communities or for coho salmon, for example. So that's what we're in process on that right now, and very excited to talk to anybody who would like to talk with us about that so we can get that shared learning.
That's really helpful. And I think, this is not this question around how we measure progress is, I think it would be suboptimal for regions to have to answer this on their own. So really understanding, how we can support regional approaches, but then provide information across the state. And I'm glad to report that Kaylee, who I kind of outed as an important resource at the state at Department of Conservation, just got back to me and said he would welcome outreach. And I just responded to him, I think, in a way that participants can see his email if people want to reach out. Joanna reminds us that the California Department of Insurance, and specifically Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara, is doing a lot of active work on understanding what the insurance and liability barriers are to prescribed fire. So they are very much in the mix on this. I want to keep, in just a little bit of time, we're going to move to our legislators, but I'm a big fan of making sure as many questions get answered as possible. John asks a set of questions for me, but really what's the state doing in stepping up to support work on national forest lands? Whether that's efficient compliance with CEQA, funding and participating landscape level plans, addressing the lack of Forest Service staffing by helping community-based collaboratives that use this good neighbor authority that lets us do work on federal land and vice versa. I think the short of that is, for me, number one is I'm trying to use my position to amplify the need for federal funding into the regional U.S. Forest Service. Simply put, federal agencies own and manage 57% of our forest lands in California, and state government is spending probably 5 to 10 times what federal agencies are able to spend on landscape management. So we're definitely making ourselves heard back in Washington, D.C., particularly with the new administration. We're really optimistic actually getting more resources into our Forest Service. We think the Forest Service is an excellent partner for CAL FIRE and for our agencies and conservancies, but they need more resources. We're also interested in figuring out ways to so-called cut the green tape to allow more of this work to happen more quickly. When we're talking about big landscape level efforts, we obviously need to do adequate environmental review and avoid unintended consequences. But at the same time, we have to recognize the catastrophic wildfire crisis is not waiting around. And so recently we established a programmatic environmental document for vegetation treatment programs. And it's pretty wonky, but in essence, what it is doing is a lot of the broad environmental work for certain types of landscape management projects to make the CEQA review move faster, specifically project to project. So we're really interested in your suggestions on that. And then a bunch of other questions, but I want to turn to our legislative partners here today. And really, they're our leaders. And a lot of what we're talking about here today, we're talking about because they really sounded the alarm in Sacramento and are driving the policy solutions. And first up, I want to introduce Assemblymember Jim Wood, who many of you know represents Assembly District 2 in California, a huge district that stretches from parts of Santa Rosa all the way to the Oregon border, out to the coast and inland. And the Assembly member's been a leader, and I won't even mention all of the legislation that he's passed and driven, but he's also been a key educator for us in the agencies to, again, avoid this one-size-fits-all approach, recognizing we need to elevate regional leaders and resource those regional efforts. So Assembly member, I'm really grateful that you're here with us, and I know you've been listening in on the conversation and just eager for insights that you have.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary, and it's an honor to be here. And yeah, I've been listening to the whole thing, and I was like, oh man, would I have loved to have been on that panel with the 4 experts you have up there, because they're awesome, and they hit on so many of the issues that I think are really critical. I do want to say one thing. You talked about the green tape. Couldn't agree more. One of the biggest impediments to doing a lot of these projects is CEQA, and I'm a big believer in CEQA, so don't get me wrong, but remember, these projects are improving the environmental quality. And so we've got to find a way to streamline that. The second point I want to bring up before I get into my more formal remarks is around prescribed burns and, you know, the concern about air quality. And I would just say this: would you prefer the air quality impacts of massive, uncontrolled wildfires to controlled burns? And that's, you know, and so we have to find a way to have our air quality management districts work with us in a more collaborative way, so that we can actually get some of this work done. So anyway, that's comments. I could comment on a whole bunch of other issues, but I won't. I want to talk about some others here. But if there was ever a time to make a paradigm shift in California, it's now on wildfires. And so, of course, that time, you know, maybe should have been 10 years ago. But if we've learned anything from the past decade, it's that we have to invest in the best knowledge, the technology and techniques to save our state from future devastation. The work the regional folks are doing in this area is critical. I just want to take a moment to call out Karen Gaffney with North Coast Resource Partnership. The North Coast Resource Partnership is, my district is nested in within that. So every part of the district I represent is part of the North Coast Resource Partnership, and it's a fabulous model. It really is. So, also want to thank the efforts to our tribal communities for their commitment to these efforts and the cultural wisdom that they bring with them for our work ahead. So thank you, Chairman Jim, for your work, and it's critically important to our success. I just want to help you understand how my life experience brought me to be so passionate about this issue. I'm a dentist. I'm about as far away from a lot of these issues as you could imagine. But you know, and I've had the opportunity to spend most of my adult life in Sonoma County. But in addition to being a dentist, I do forensic consulting. And so as such, I help identify victims in tragedies, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, the wildfires in 2017, and most recently, the Paradise Fire, identifying victims there. There's nothing that motivates me more than making sure these events don't happen again. And so the victims whose lives were taken deserve, and those who have been left behind by this trauma deserve nothing less. And that's one of the reasons I push so hard. We know there are ways the state can make progress in preventing wildfires. We need the resources to build fuel breaks, continue vegetation management, both on public and private lands, and help homeowners harden their homes. That's a really key thing. I've worked on this issue for the past 6 years through the maze of our current structure. It's apparent that we have a patchwork of local entities that vary greatly in their sophistication and their capacity. In some communities, it's a resource conservation district. In others, it's a fire safe council or local government or fire district. The patchwork has led to inconsistency, and some communities get left behind altogether. Their efforts have all been worthy and are all appreciated, but they can be much more effective and efficient. A regional forest fire capacity program, thank you, Karen, for mentioning this, can help provide these things: flexible block grants to regional entities, planning and coordinated actions across jurisdictions, and serving as the translator between state programs and goals and the existing local groups working on fire preparedness. There's a constant balance between flexible dollars that are turned quickly into work on the ground and accountability for how those dollars are spent as public funds. Our hope is that regional hubs will help connect the right projects with the right programs. Obviously, different regions have different needs, and we absolutely need to allow for that. There are more than 100 deliverables in the Forest and Fire Action Plan. The $1 billion is spread out over 21 programs, 11 units of government, including electric utilities and Caltrans. I want to see this executed and not turned into another study on the shelf. Fire season will be here soon, and we need urgency. I'm very disappointed that there were $0 for fire in the first early action budget items. I hope there's another round of early action coming soon. We can't afford to wait any longer. And again, I thank those who've been moving ahead, albeit in a more fractured way than it's optimal. And I look forward to doing what I can to help this plan move forward. to get a structure that's more coordinated so we can leverage the work in a more effective way. And if there's any way we can bring more people to the table at the same time to help expedite these projects and break down some silos, give me a hammer. I'm ready to go.
Well, thanks for, you're well put, articulate, passionate, the sense of urgency and focus is palpable. I can tell you, we're going to hold ourselves accountable for those actions in the action plan, and we're going to announce a retooled task force with a specific focus on publicly transparent, measurements on each of those actions, because we want to turn whatever funding the legislature ultimately approves, we want to turn that into action on the ground. And to me, we fail if panelists like those here today don't actually see the resources coming in a flexible way that allow them to prioritize across regions. And I share your enthusiasm for getting early action funding as quickly as possible to put this funding down. And I'll also say, if I could, one of our goals with the way that we propose the $1 billion is to provide sort of consistent funding over time. I think something we've heard from a lot of the regional folks is this episodic, on again, off again is really hard to develop this pipeline of projects. And then I think it's up to us and the agencies to help figure out how to cut the red tape, as you say, to get more projects done more quickly and cost effectively. Let me bring in one of your colleagues from the other house, and that is Senator Henry Stern. Senator Stern represents a whole different part of California, the 27th district in Los Angeles that stretches from north of Santa Monica along the coast to far inland, including parts of the San Fernando Valley. And Senator Stern, I think, has been personally impacted by the wildfires, losing at least one of the homes, the apartment where you were living, but then also has been really vocal and kind of provided me a personal education on making sure that we don't pretend that the challenges we face in Northern California with wildfires are similar to those that are faced in Southern California. The chaparral environment that we talked about here today, the more sort of suburban, urbanized wildland-urban interface. So, Senator Sturm, I'm interested in sort of where you see this discussion on wildfire resilience. And, you have here, we've talked with 4 panelists today, including Susie from Southern California, just about how to elevate and empower regional leadership for regional solutions, which I know has been kind of a mantra of yours.
Yep.
So excited for any sort of insights or observations you can provide here.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. And yeah, shout out to Assemblymember Wood. You cannot underestimate how important Jim Wood is to maintaining urgency in the legislative conversation about wildfire. I think the people who are on this Zoom and your staff and all the stakeholders that we work with, we sort of all get it, right? We're sort of naturally like, we're still in the emergency. The state is still on fire in our mind, and we know it's going to happen again. But politically, we have to find some way to build consensus and reach into like a bunch of different regions and urban and ex-urban and suburban and rural and build a coalition. So I wholeheartedly share the Assembly members' enthusiasm for early action and sustained action here. But the point you bring up, Mr. Secretary, on the sort of principles of say Southern California or different fire ecologies, I think are echoed in some of the questions I'm seeing in your chat here from Suzanne and Douglas. When I went through Woolsey, that's where I got my first education on home ignition zone principles and wind-driven, ember-driven fires, where we had, little pieces of ember from invasive grasses burned, say, half a mile away, blowing over a freeway and into 1 or 2 vents in one community, and suddenly you get the domino effect where that one home can take a whole community down. And we saw that happening. It wasn't like walls of fire were burning down the Santa Monica Mountains, the homes in those Santa Monica Mountains. Now, there are parts where it sort of builds that energy, but we've been trying to preach that sort of regionally driven, ecologically driven approach to fire treatment that starts in these particular communities from the home out, not necessarily from the forest in. I think what's really exciting about the work that like Jessica Morse and Patrick Wright and like the folks at your Forest Management Task Force are doing in building, also with DOC and KLEE and that whole RFFC concept, and having these sort of regional designees and trying to get some connectivity between those sort of conservancies and land management agencies, and then that buffer between them and property. Because the tricky thing about how we started this whole sort of fire conversation years back was we were very carbon focused at first, somewhat because the funding stream came from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So we were sort of trying to figure out, okay, how do we maximize carbon reduction and keep carbon standing in stock? And look, I'm going to be moving legislation in the climate restoration, natural working lands arena. I'm the chair of the resources committee, huge priority. But we've got to, I think, also think about the carbon sitting in unburnt homes that should be avoided. But beyond carbon, really letting risk to life and property drive some of our work, and using those metrics, hopefully in the next rounds of sort of these blueprints that you guys are developing and helping drive some of the funding, I think we can start to resolve it. You know, I think of right now the challenges we're trying to go through with MRCA in our backyard in the Santa Monica Mountains. And you got a bunch of conservancy land mixed in with state parks land, mixed in with federal land, butting right up to privately owned smaller homeowners land where there's gullies and culverts and things that need to be managed within a private landowner's purview. But that ESHA, all that sensitive ecology right up next to homes, takes a really ecologically sensitive approach to treatment, but it can't be ignored. Like, we can't just pretend it's not there and not deal with it. And yet the funding we push is often capital funding, right? It's not always operations and maintenance funding. So the nature of the funding we've even been typically pushing out through bonds says, you know, it gives you money maybe for land acquisition, but to have the staff and the person power to go do this work, or the shepherd power, or the, you know, restoration power. I mean, this is very hands-on intensive work. And the good thing is people need jobs. And I actually think that all this work we're talking about here is dollar for dollar some of the most jobs intensive work we can possibly do as a state to get ourselves recovered. I think we can make that case. I mean, I think UCLA Luskin Center did a study on past expenditures in forest health and fire prevention, and it was literally like the #1 near-term most person-intensive work we could possibly be doing. So I'm really excited about it. You know, and here in the Senate, we're trying to sort of push that urgency, and we so appreciate the governor sort of making the opening salvo, and we're going to keep pushing. We need everyone to listen to Assemblymember Wood over in the Assembly, because I don't think the public will be disappointed in us if we sort of underbid each other and end up in some kind of political impasse. Like, people are comfortable with going big. We just did, you know, we're on the verge of a $9.6 billion COVID response package. So when we talk about $1 billion compared to the scope of, say, a $5 billion fire season, it's not that much. And I also think that, you know, when it comes to longer term picture, which we really also hope we can get going, while we do early action, I want to try to get this bond onto a ballot in 22. It was remiss down the home stretch at the end of last session not to get something done, because the voters want it. And even if you don't live right in fire country, you still know wildfire is a problem. It's going to hit you somehow. And we've actually been looking at some of the externalities for non-fire community members, the embedded subsidy that they're paying to folks who live in the fire areas by keeping that fire department up and running, the general tax liability. I don't think Compton should be subsidizing Calabasas's fire problem, right? I mean, that's the thing. I've got to convince my colleagues in LA that we actually have to get ahead of this thing so we can save your residents money and your liabilities in the long term. And oh, by the way, keep our communities from burning down as well. So it's a tough challenge, but look, the institution building you're doing, and especially now with the Wildfire Safety Commission coming over under 901 to CNRA, like, Secretary Crowfoot, you are the tip of the spear here, and I think you can do this job. We've seen you do it at the very highest level, like looking face to face with the former president and not blinking. And I think the people are with you and the science is with you. But now we just got to get, the stakeholders to help us unlock the legislature. And I think that would be my big ask from everyone who's maybe not within resources or this administration, but sort of think about where you represent. If you're at a conservancy or an RCD, or you're in a local fire department, who's your state senator and who's your assembly member? Please start to engage with them and let them know that this isn't just big talk from Sacramento, that this is coming bottom up. And I think, if we really embrace that, I think we can make some progress this year.
Well, it's huge. I mean, for those that don't follow the discussion in Sacramento, with these two leaders, you have a very clear sense of the level of sophisticated thought, but then also the passion and urgency that's brought to this discussion in the legislature. And Senator, I don't know if you heard me say that I think if the pandemic weren't happening, wildfire would be priority 1A in the Capitol, and even with the pandemic, it's still a huge priority. But your point, and the Assemblymember's point, is well taken, which is, those working in this space have to make their sort of insights clear to the legislators that represent folks across California. We're joined by several hundred people and leaders across California today, and the time is now really to share this information. I think you guys have made a great point. We have to do this. The cost argument is clear. My colleague Jared Blumenfeld over at Cal EPA says they were spending over $2 billion on removing sort of the hazardous stuff after the Paradise fire. And that's one fire, $2 billion. And so obviously we need to get in front, because we're going to pay on the back end at a much greater level. The public health imperative is undeniable. I have a 6-year-old that couldn't play outside in Sacramento for a large part of the summer because of dangerous air quality. And I know everybody across the state experienced that. So clearly the time is now. It's a collective effort. I think my one takeaway from today is, as you all as leaders in the legislature and the governor consider what to do, we have to be driven by these ground up insights of the folks across our state in the regions getting it done. Whether it's, the fire safe councils in suburban Los Angeles that are really saying, hey, we have to do more on fire hardening. Or the tribal leaders that are saying, we have people on the sidelines that we need to actually bring into the workforce. Or the RCDs that say, we have the plan, we just need the flexible resources to implement. So I'm ultimately really optimistic. I'm also clear-eyed to the fact that the challenge continues. This is a dry winter, which is likely going to mean another very challenging wildfire season. So I think we can retain the optimism, but work with the sort of that so-called fierce urgency of now, just recognizing the challenge we face. So huge thanks, Assemblymember Senator, for joining. I think it's a great way to conclude our discussion. Big thanks, Chairman Jim, Karen, Susie, Todd, for the discussion, and ultimately, big thanks to all the participants who joined here today. We've got our work cut out for us, but I know that together we can make strong, visible progress as soon as this year. So thanks once again for joining, and we will see you again, hopefully in person, hopefully fairly soon. And lastly, for those who are still on and not clicking off, if you want to learn about future discussions within our Secretary Speaker series, where we unpack priorities like this, you can see on the screen the website to access to join our listserv mailing list. We only provide we'll only email you about once a month to provide you updates on these types of discussions and other news. So thanks once again for joining us, and have a great week.